Mr. President, I was in my office and watching the senator on TV, so I thought I'd come down here and maybe we could get to the bottom of this. There seems to be ships passing in the night, it seems to me. And I know the senator from California cares passionately about this issue. And I don't question that for a moment. It's very clear to me. But I would just ask the senator from California, she graciously agreed to co-sponsor this legislation. She voted for it in the Senate Judiciary Committee that passed unanimously. It does contain on page 50 and 51 of this bill the language that the senator referred to. I saw it on my TV screen in my office, which incorporates the limitation that was contained in the Consolidated Appropriation Act of 2014. It incorporates that into the bill by reference. And not only, I believe, the senator voted for the bill in committee and co-sponsored it, the senator also voted for that limitation in the Consolidated Appropriation Act of 2014. This is the same or similar language to what was contained in the Affordable Care Act, contained in defense authorization bills, and contained in literally every appropriation bill since 1976. So here's what I would love to have my friend and the senator from California explain to me. Why is it that it all of a sudden becomes objectionable on this legislation when you care and I care so passionately about getting help for these victims that this is the reason to derail the legislation?
Because of what this legislation is. This legislation is the raping and the misconduct sexually with young girls, girls 14, 15, and 16. What if they're impregnated? Should they be entitled to be able to go and get an abortion? Does this body really want them to be forced to bear somebody's child? And so this offers the opportunity for some funding. These aren't wealthy girls. They don't live in Beverly Hills or Hyde Park or any of these places that are prominent. They're on the streets. They're lost, maybe lost mentally, lost physically. They may have been abused. And now they're caught up in an industry where they're held hostage at night. I've read of some in a neighborhood of my city being handcuffed at night, stripped so they don't have clothes and can't run away. They're put out on the streets, they're watched, they're moved around. It becomes too hot in one area, they're moved to another state. They come from other countries. And it just seems to me to have this in this bill. And Senator, I have great respect for you. I have wanted to work with you on this. I know you are sincere. It's not in the House bill. So maybe the House understands this. I can't speak for the House.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy.
Is there objection without objection?
I would be happy to. I think we
Without
ought to
objection.
discuss this.
Otherwise, Mr. President, we're going to have to keep addressing questions through the chair and asking permission. And I think I'd just like to have a chance to have an honest conversation with my friend. So it is clear that the senator from California that has voted for this restriction on the use of taxpayer funding for abortion previously, correct?
Not to my knowledge. Let me put it that way. Now, you can blame me, and you can say I should have known.
No, I'm honest.
When I'm not the only one on our committee, Senator, who's in this position either, who communicated with your staff and was under the impression that the bill was identical to last year.
Well,
with exception of 7 pieces, which is not this. The 7 were detailed to us.
I'm not going to engage in a debate about whether you should have known or how you voted in the past. I do believe the record would demonstrate that you, among others, voted for the Affordable Care Act, which actually the National Abortion Rights Action League says is an expansion of the Hyde Amendment. But let me ask the senator, you rightly point out that these child victims of sexual assault will have been raped. either a statutory rape, they're below the age of consent, or they're adults and they have been assaulted, criminally assaulted. Isn't it your understanding of the Hyde Amendment that the exclusion to the Hyde Amendment would still allow them to gain access to the services that you believe they need and deserve?
Yes, I think that's correct. And I suppose we could change this to have a rape implication, but the gauntlet has been thrown down. And it's not up to me alone to remove it. There was no open discussion in our committee when we discussed this that there was a highly sensitive issue in it, Senator. Now you can say, and I'll plead mea culpa, and guess what? I will wave a whip and get my staff, they will look henceforth at every code change. And you and I know that occasionally things slip through. I will plead mea culpa on that. But once I found out, I had an obligation to do something about it. And so I am pleading with you, let's just take it out. Let's just pass this bill. Let's put the Feinstein Amendment on. Let's go after the internet purveyors. Let's go after 19 sites who put pictures of girls 12, 13, and 14 to be sold all around the United States, to be sold after big football games in various areas of the country. Let's go after them. Isn't that more important?
Mr. President,
I'd like to
I agree
ask you a question.
That's the reason I'm so confused by the filibuster of this legislation by people, including my friend who are the co-sponsor of the legislation who already voted for it. And I'm not about pointing fingers in terms of what staff or members should have read or understood by the legislation, but I believe the reason why it was not debated at the Judiciary Committee level is because it had become a routine matter since 1976 when the Hyde Amendment was passed. Every appropriation of labor HHS or other funding that could arguably use tax dollars for abortions has been limited by the Hyde Amendment language. I had a couple of senators in my office yesterday afternoon who are proudly pro-choice. I'm proudly pro-life. But even my pro-choice friends said, we still believe taxpayer funds should not be used for abortions, except in the case of rape or to protect the health of the victim.
Well, why then, may I ask you a question respectfully? Sure. Why then isn't it in the House language?
I would say to my friend, I can't vouch for the House's product. I can just tell you what the Congress as a whole has done since 1976, and it's to limit the expenditure of funds for this purpose under the terms of the Hyde Amendment. That was the reason why we referred in the legislation on page 50 that you've blown up here, referring it to the language in the Appropriation Committee, which I'm confident my friend, the senator from California, voted for, just like you did in the limitation that was contained in the Affordable Care Act and all the other times that Hyde has been part of our process. This has become so unremarkable and so routine that it hardly seems like something you would point out because this language doesn't change the status quo at all. So I would, we've talked about ways to get past this impasse, and I would just have to say that I think abandoning the Hyde Amendment would be a dramatic and mistake and something I'm not willing to be a part of. It's become this one area in a divisive area of abortion where there has been bipartisan consensus for 39 years, at least to the point that it's remained the law of the land effectively. So to take it out and to say somehow we're going to depart from that today or this week would, to me, be a dramatic expansion of taxpayer funding for this purpose that I can't support. So I would say if there are ways that we can deal with this fund as a fund that can be appropriated on an annual basis, subject to the normal restrictions. I talked to this ranking member, our friend from Vermont, about that possibility. I think there's ways that we might be able to get to a solution. But stripping out this limitation, which has been the law of the land for 39 years, is not acceptable, because it would represent a huge expansion on the use of taxpayer funding for abortions in ways that many of my pro-choice friends don't support.
Well, see, I guess I disagree with that. Those of us that believe that a woman should control her own reproductive system in concert with her family and her doctor really have objection to the government getting involved and telling us what to do. It's actually not your reproductive system, and I say you generically as a man. It is our reproductive system. And so, in a sense, this has been a battle for our identity. I sat on a term setting and paroling authority in California in the 1960s when abortion was illegal. I sentenced women to state prison for abortion. It had then an indeterminate sentence of between 6 months and 10 years. I saw the abortionists come back to prison. I asked one, when I was setting the sentence, why do you keep doing this? Her first name was Anita. And she said, because I feel so sorry for the women. And that was the way it was. I remember passing the plate at Stanford for a young woman to go to Tijuana for an abortion. The morbidity that was done to women through back alley abortions. This is all, you've opened a Pandora's box of big emotional issues for women. And the Hyde Amendment, you know, there is rape. If you can prove it, that's right. And then there is a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old that's out on the streets as a prostitute. It's a different thing, sort of the same, but sort of different. And the overwhelming evil of this trade overcomes any of this, because you take a young woman and you probably change their life for the worst for the rest of their life. Can you imagine your daughter being out on the street? My granddaughters being out on the street like this, and what it does to them, being handcuffed and moved and traded around the country, and girls brought from Nepal through India, all over Europe. This is what's going on in the world today. So we're sitting here arguing, essentially, about the availability of an abortion in this area. And to me, that is so secondary to the enormous harm that's being done. And so I really beg, I have great respect for you. You've been a very distinguished jurist in your state. You make sense when you speak on the Judiciary Committee. We've listened to each other for more than a decade now. Let this drop. Let us get on with the work of this bill. The work of this bill isn't completed until we get some of the amendments that relate to the bill. And then I think we can debate this another day. I would plead a mea culpa. I wish I knew. All I can tell you is I did not know. Is that my fault? Probably, but I didn't know. So if you don't know and you make a mistake, isn't the right thing to try to set that right? And that's what we've tried to do. And women on our side and some on your side feel very strongly about this. And you know, over the years, we've lost virtually every battle that's been on this floor. And we're tired of it. So we're taking a stand, and we're going to hold that stand.
Mr. President, I obviously don't agree with my friend from California, but I respect her for answering the questions that I've posed here today. I just find it a terrible shame that we're going to relitigate the law, what's been the law of the land for 39 years, on this bill in a way that would block help to the very people that I know that the senator from California cares so passionately about. Because that's if we're going to undo the Hyde Amendment, which the senator has voted for in some form or another repeatedly over the years, then we're not going to make any progress. If we can find some other way to structure the fund so that the appropriators will have a more direct role in appropriating fines and penalties paid into this fund on an annual basis, I think maybe there's some room to talk. But I thank the senator for her courtesy in answering my questions. I'm sorry that we find ourselves at this loggerheads, but I hope at some point
May I
that will
say
be
one more
resolved.
thing to you? It's my understanding, breaking news coming here, that there is no language in federal statute on sex trafficking that defines a trafficking survivor as a victim of rape. So the victim would have to prove that she's a victim of rape. Now, look at what happens. I don't know if in your legal career it took you close to victims, of very young victims of this, who cover up, who don't want to let people know. You know all the vicissitudes. You know the hard life. You're asking someone who, she has to prove it.
I would say to my friend that when I was Attorney General of Texas for 4 years, I had responsibility for administering the Crime Victims Compensation Fund as part of my duties of office. And we worked very directly with victims groups, including those who took care of very young children who had been sexually assaulted, sometimes by members of their own family, just the worst, most reprehensible sorts of crimes. But can I ask the senator just one last question? Of course, the procedural vote we've had here on the floor twice now, where Democrats have blocked our ability to both vote on amendments, including amendments that the senator may have, with the senator from Illinois, Senator Kirk. Why is there an objection to processing those amendments and allowing the Senate to work its will? Why can't we vote on it? Why can't the Democratic minority take up the majority leader's offer for a vote to strip the language out that you object to?
Can I answer that as honestly as I feel?
I would appreciate it.
Because there are many of us that believe this is one small step for womankind. It's one battle that we can win. And we have had loss after loss after loss. And, you know, many of us ran on the right to choose. I was one of them. I'm old enough to have seen the way it was before, to have sentenced women who committed illegal abortions with coat hangers. And that is sort of the systemic root of all of this. It's our history, Senator. And we're trying to change that history, and we keep losing. So there's one small thing in this. Right, you're right, we didn't see it. And we have to live with that. I understand it, but now we see it, and we're trying to do something about it, and thanks, our party is standing up with us. So we say, make that small change, and we pass this bill, and maybe we can even strengthen it in amendments, and you have done a superior job in putting the bill together. Let it go.
Mr. President, I would just say in conclusion that I think it's a terrible shame that your side of the aisle has decided to take this bill hostage to try to litigate something that's been the law of the land for 39 years. And I understand you feel passionately about it. I don't question that for a minute, the sincerity of your deeply held personal views. But why in the world would you take a hostage a piece of legislation that's going to help those 100,000 children who are sex trafficked each year? Why should they suffer so that you can make a point on this particular piece of legislation? I just don't understand that, and I just think it's a terrible shame.
Well, let me answer a question with a question. Why don't you just take it out? It's not in the House bill. Then we don't have to conference it. We don't have to have another fight. We can get the amendments in the bill to strengthen the bill, and we can move on, and the two parties together can do something that's right for the nation. Why don't we do it?
Well, Mr. President, I would say to my friend, I don't blame her for asking, but why in the world would we change the settled law for 39 years just in order to accommodate the minority's view on this bill and to change, like I said, what has been the law of the land? I don't.
Because
since the senator voted for this very language previously in this year in the Judiciary Committee, since you co-sponsored it, I mean, I don't really understand this. Since you voted for the legislation that is the referred to here that has that amendment. Do you see this as breaking new ground? Are you trying to expand or eliminate the Hyde Amendment?
I see it as standing up for a principle. I know something about these girls. I know something about the history of abortion in this country. I'm old enough to have gone through it and know that I don't want to go back to those days. I don't want young women who take the law now so much for granted to have to return back. This is just one small step. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with accommodating the minority on what is a relatively small point. Obviously, it's not in the House. It's a relatively small point. You got 435 people over there that didn't want it in. So why not accommodate the minority? You'd just come out a bigger person.
Mr. President, I'd say to my friend, and I appreciate her courtesy and her indulgence in having this conversation. It is not, I also feel on principle that this limitation on tax dollars is an appropriate one. And I understand the senator disagrees, and she'd like to eliminate this from this point forward. But I'm simply unable, on principle, to accommodate the senator in that request. And as I said, I do appreciate your courtesy. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it too, and I appreciate the discussion. And you know, principle doesn't know minority and majority. Principle is deeply held. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Do you have Loretta Lynch? I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.